Welcome to episode 7 of Modern Monarch.
I am your host, Eddie Mead, aka Elmer. Everything here you hear that is not a quote from something is my opinion. I am an independent musician, songwriter, parapolitics researcher, esoterica enthusiast, and Montauk boy. This podcast will mainly cover such topics as mind control, ritual abuse, mental illness, substance abuse and addiction, music, sus Wisconsin, and more, viewed through a lens of dialectical materialism. I will maintain a balanced approach of presenting grounded research based on extensive reading and people's personal experiences. It will especially focus on a specific investigation of mine into decades-long countrywide conspiracies. As I explain, you will come to know why I began this podcast in the first place.
This is part 2 of our look into the Dozier School for boys. I did not originally plan to separate this episode into parts, so any mention of content in future episodes refers to the next topic that we will be covering as part of the background information for Violet, the Project Monarch survivor that I am going to be interviewing very soon. We left off at the end of last episode hearing from survivors of the abuse at Dozier School. They were explaining for us the interest that people in Marianna, Florida had in the school financially and for even darker reasons. It was mentioned that a reward was paid to locals in Marianna who would capture runaways.
Now, a little more from the article in the Atavist magazine, because it mentions the reward for capturing runaways. Quote, Somnitz never found out what became of the child, but the incident didn't stop him from running away one day himself. Even if he made it past the guards, Somnitz knew that the school paid a bounty for runners to the locals in Marianna, up to $25 a boy. At one time, runaways was listed in the school records as the second highest budget item. Dressed in his pajamas, Somnitz ran through the woods, and he recalls hearing gunshots sail past him. He managed to elude his pursuers and successfully escape back to his family, never returning to the school. Other men, like Cooper, were haunted by memories of acts even worse than rapes and beatings. At the White House Boys meeting, Roger Kaiser, now a 66-year-old author, told of seeing a boy under a sheet being carried from the school laundry. Quote within quote, another one of you little bastards just bit the dust. End quote within quote. A supervisor told him, he remembers. Dick Cologne, who worked in the laundry several years later, said he once saw a boy tumbling in an industrial dryer, then carried out under a sheet on a stretcher. The bodies of many of the boys who vanished from the school under such circumstances, the White House Boys claimed, had been dumped in unmarked graves on the school grounds. Some of them, they believed, were in the cemetery on the African American side of the campus. The cemetery was called Boot Hill, a term the boys might have recognized from the movies. It was what burial grounds were called in the Wild West, so named for the men who died with their boots on in gunfights. The cemetery bordered the school's garbage dump. How many bodies were buried there was an open question. Campus records were spotty or non-existent, and some of the graves belonged to campus pets, a pair of dogs and a peacock named Sue. By the 1960s, the wooden crosses that originally marked the boys' plots had rotted away. One day, Lennox Link Williams, a hulking, tobacco-chewing psychologist who had recently joined the staff, led a troop of Boy Scouts from the school up to Boot Hill to plant cement crosses where he guessed the graves might have been. Better to have too many, he later recalled, than too few. End quote. The psychologist who made that chilling statement we just read will come up later as I introduce more faculty members. The cemetery is dealt with at length towards the end. In that reading, we also learned of another possible death of a boy at the school. 81 were documented, but many survivors believe that there were a lot more. If I may morbidly speculate on one method of body disposal, the school's farm had an entire swine department or hog department. I saw both names used in different Yellow Jacket articles. So, a huge herd of hungry pigs was right there on campus. Anyway, back to what survivor Robert Straley called boy hunting. Locals would hunt for runaway boys, then kidnap and torture them. It is reminiscent of the human hunting, most dangerous game type stories that have been told by survivors of Project Monarch. It will come up in Violet's story as well. It was tedious going through 4 decades of the Yellow Jacket, but if I hadn't, I may have missed things like Arthur Dozier's visit to Boys Town. However, I almost wanted to include every tiny thing I found that could conceivably be seen as sus somehow. I could list every dentist and their credentials, or every visitor reported. Some are more interesting than others, like Dr. Rickles, the interning dentist who was previously an electrochemist at the Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia, or Dr. Edward Wallace, the dentist who served in the Navy from 1950 to 1952 doing medical research at Bethesda, Maryland. Or Dr. Carola Lutz from the January 5th, 1952 article, Florida School Most Interesting, says German doctor. She was in the country on the cultural exchange program, studying child welfare and correctional procedures. Upon her return to Germany, she sent Arthur Dozier a card that read, in part, quote, "Your school was more interesting than any other I saw in the USA, and I owe you some good ideas which I try to introduce here." End quote. Looks like German doctors exchanging ideas with Americans appears yet again in our story. I have exercised some self-control and left out a lot of little tidbits like those so we can focus on the characters and events that have a more direct bearing on our story. I'm not sure the private flying license one of the psychologists got in 1958 is the most important thing to get to today, but it definitely reminds me of the sus Dr. Brian Cleary from the Curtis Blake schools. Returning to the timeline I am somewhat attempting to follow. In April 1950, the boys' school zoo formally opened. It held many animals, including a panther, other wildcats, eagles, monkeys, a silver fox, snakes, and alligators. The zoo comes up in Violet's story, so I wanted to mention its opening now so you will already know it exists. I'm not even including every single psychologist the school had in this episode, but take my word for it that they were all pretty weird. I was trying to narrow down the ones who I would bring up, but then something like this would happen. I would come across an article like, "Psychologist is added to local staff," published September 16, 1950 in the Yellow Jacket. Okay, who is it and what is their history? Bernard F. Shepler. While attending Florida State University, he was a student research assistant to Dr. Anders Sweetland at the Human Relations Institute in Tallahassee. The article says that Sweetland, quote, "comes to the school regularly and is well known here," end quote. Alright, I should look into Dr. Anders Sweetland then. I found the thesis he presented to get his degree at the University of North Dakota. Its title is Hypnotic Neuroses, Hypochondrias, and Depression. It is about using hypnosis to induce changes in personality. So, good thing I didn't overlook him, because it sounds like I found a mind control doctor who was a regular visitor to the school in the early 50s already, and there are more we will cover. Shepler is interesting too, because he left to become an army psychologist during the Korean War, which is when the idea of brainwashed soldiers, aka Manchurian candidates, became popular. A few months after Shepler's departure, the school's clinical psychologist Bill Schmidt resigned to take a position with the FBI. An April 26, 1952 issue of the Yellow Jacket has an article titled, "Two German Youths Speak to Local Students on Monday." This made me laugh because they were obviously there to spread Cold War anti-Soviet propaganda. One of them was the son of a prominent Berlin physician and discussed, quote, freedom after living under communist rule, end quote. The other father was a Russian prisoner of war for several years, a German colonel held as a prisoner of war by the Russians, eh? In other words, a Nazi. A January 25th, 1958 version of the News and Views from the Guidance Center section in the Yellow Jacket brings up Russia, but in a positive light, and it also made me laugh. Quote, the recent investigations of our public schools and the comparisons drawn between the educational opportunities in our country and those found in the Russian schools have been highly publicized during the past few weeks. The fact that we are behind the Russian and European schools in many areas has been brought forcibly to the attention of the American public by Russian scientific developments. Educational psychologists have been trying for years to convince Americans that this state of affairs existed, but without too much success. The undeniable superiority of the Russian rocket has succeeded where the psychologists failed. As might be expected, there has been a furor of activity and investigations into the reasons that we have lost the lead we thought we held for so long. One of the first facts brought to light was that in some areas, such as mathematics, physics, and basic science, we did not actually lose the lead because we never had it. End quote. I want to quickly bring up something from an April 6, 1957 Yellow Jacket article titled, Committee Vote Split on Open Court Proceedings in Cases Involving Children. This refers to the Governor's Committee on Juvenile Delinquency, which Arthur Dozier was a part of. While the committee was split about whether to open court proceedings to the public for children's cases, the entire committee recommended, quote, giving officers the authority to fingerprint children taken into custody on, quote, within quote, reasonable grounds, end quote, within quote, to believe them guilty of a crime. Juvenile judges would have authority to say whether the prints would be sent to the FBI files in Washington. The group recommended the universal fingerprinting of all children when they enter junior high school. Members explained this would be used for identification purposes and not for any anti-delinquency measures. End quote. Sure, that does not sound like it could be used for dark, dystopian, and authoritarian purposes whatsoever. A database of children and their fingerprints. It sounds like something someone such as Epstein would love. Moving on, let's meet more staff members with sketchy histories and connections. The creepy Dr. Robert L. Curry, mentioned earlier, is a part of Violet's story, so let's get to know him a little. He was mentioned towards the end of the last episode when my friend Clouds read from Anna Starfire's book for us, and I'll quickly repeat what was read. Quote, Dr. Souza and Dr. Curry worked on tracking the harmonics and frequencies of human brains as the boys grew at Dozier. They were looking for specific frequencies for communication use. End quote. I have also noticed his name in testimonies and depositions more often than most other staff members. He comes up in Troy Tidwell's deposition.
Let me jump back for a minute. We got sidetracked a little bit. We were talking about Mr. Curry. Do you know why Mr. Curry left the school?
I really don't.
Do you remember the circumstances under which he left?
I can't. I don't know exactly what it was all about.
Was there an investigation at the school during Governor Claude Kirk's administration during which Mr. Curry left the school?
I think he's the governor that when he came out there and visited in the department, he suggested that all the boys needed to be in school. And I think that's the time whenever they closed the dairy, the farm, the garden, and all.
Governor Kirk was
industrial art shop, the sheet metal shop.
Governor Kirk was upset by what he saw at the school, was he not?
Objects to the form. Yes,
What was that?
You can answer the question. They're just objecting for that.
What was the question?
The question was whether Governor Kirk was upset by what he saw when he came to the school.
Same objection.
I didn't hear anything he was upset about. Of course, that wouldn't have come from the superintendent to me, you know.
Well, I didn't really think the superintendent would tell you, but do you remember reading newspaper articles either then or now where Governor Kirk was quoted as saying, if this was your child, you'd be out there with guns?
Object to the form.
Did you ever read anything about that?
No.
Did you ever hear anything about Mr. Curry sexually abusing any of the boys that were at the school? Never heard anything about that?
Well, if that happened and the superintendent got a hold of it, it wouldn't be a matter of waiting to decide what to do with Mr. Curry.
Because that's just wrong. Is that what you mean?
Well, you didn't. There's a few things, you know, that when the superintendent found out about it, I mean, if it's an employee, he didn't stay there. Just like, yeah, I mean,
We will probably eventually get to that news article mentioned, the one regarding Florida's governor at the time remarking that, quote, if one of your kids were kept in such circumstances, you'd be up there with rifles, end quote. In that clip, we heard Troy Tidwell deny knowledge that Dr. Curry sexually abused boys. This is extremely eye-opening. We did read earlier that Curry used to rub boys' shoulders and would ask them if they had sex with their own mothers. The school went through guidance center employees and doctors at a pretty high turnover rate. I assume they either flourished in the environment of abuse and experimentation or were glad to move on as soon as they could manage. It has not made this research simple. I was able to find a fair amount of info on Dr. Curry, though, which is good because he is important to our story. Articles in the Tallahassee Democrat and Pensacola News Journal from late March 1956 announce his arrival to the Dozier School. Strangely, although I think it is just a typo, an October 20th, 1957 Panama City News article says he took over the Guidance Center in 1955. Let's read that article anyway. Quote, guidance rather than discipline, key at Florida School for Boys. Mariana. Teachers and officials of the Florida School for Boys at Mariana know more about, quote within quote, what makes Sammy run, end quote within quote, than ever before. They know more about the intelligence of the boys committed to their care, what the boys have learned, what their problems are, how they have improved since coming to the school, and what can be done to help each one. This knowledge, searched out by the School Guidance Center, is bringing about a basic change in approach to the treatment of boys. More and more, the key word is becoming guidance rather than discipline alone. Plans for the future reflect this shift. Superintendent Arthur G. Dozier has asked that 2 more professional persons be added to the 3-man staff of the Guidance Center this year. Long-range plans, as outlined by Guidance Center Director Robert Curry, call for one guidance specialist for each 2 of the school's 19 residential cottages, 2 casework supervisors, and 2 directors. Already under construction is a psychiatric clinic to house boys who need to be separated from the rest of the students. Some of these, Curry said, will be boys who seemingly cannot profit from the regular program, and others will be those who can gain from intensive psychiatric help. Altogether, they will account for the 100% of the student body, which takes up about half of staff time. Curry noted, however, that it will take some time to get the necessary staff and set up the clinic program. The new approach in training at the Florida School for Boys has developed fastest in the past year and a half. For more than 7 years, a guidance staff has existed on the campus, but its services were chiefly of an incidental nature. The change started when Robert Curry took over as director of the Guidance Center on July 1st, 1955. Curry had studied sociology and psychology at Carleton College in Minnesota, at the University of Pennsylvania, and Michigan State University, and had worked in state prisons, a parental home for boys, a juvenile court, correctional schools, and public schools. He immediately began reorganizing the FSB Guidance Center. Assisting him were 2 psychologists and Mrs. James Smith, secretary for the center, whose knowledge of established school practices and policies helped in setting up the program. One psychologist, Joel McLean, had already been at the school several months, and Ralph Walker arrived shortly after Curry became director. Perhaps most important of all, the center now keeps complete clinical records for each boy in the school. These materials remain confidential. Curry also started the practice of submitting regular statistical and progress reports to Superintendent Dozier. Quote within quote, I think we have more than adequately demonstrated that the role of guidance in rehabilitating boys contributes greatly to the purpose for which the school is established, end quote within quote, Curry said. The superintendent agrees. Every boy who enters the school visits the guidance center at least 3 times. Within the first 2 weeks after his admission, he takes tests which measure his learning ability and his school progress, and is interviewed by a staff member. Though Curry and his staff find it best to wait 10 or 12 days after the boy arrives to have the interview and give tests, an occasional case calls for immediate attention. At the interview, the boy has a chance to express himself freely and learns from the start that there is a place on the campus where he can go and discuss matters important to him. After that, the boys may ask further help from the center or may be referred there by a teacher, cottage father, or school official. The Guidance Center also helps boys in its care overcome their problems through bodybuilding exercises. Psychologist Ralph Walker was instrumental in getting weightlifting added to the school recreation program. Weightlifting, Walker pointed out, has psychological as well as physical advantages. It helps overcome severe inferiority complexes about size and development. Since training is hard work, boys who have invested a lot in building up their strength want to take care of their bodies with good habits. Quote within quote, many people have distorted ideas of practitioners of mental health, end quote within quote, Director Curry noted. Quote within quote, parents particularly gain from hearing what we are doing to help their boys, end quote within quote, and end quote. Knowing what we do about Curry and what we will learn about him, that quote at the end takes on a different meaning. So, Robert Curry had quite the career already in the decade or so between his schooling and showing up at Dozier to take control of the Guidance Center. He had worked in other MKULTRA hotspots like state prisons. There was one job in particular that I found to be interesting once I looked into it. First, I will read a short section of the March 24, 1956 Yellow Jacket article about him joining the Dozier staff. Quote, after receiving his professional degree in social work from Michigan State University, Curry entered the psychiatric clinic for an internship oriented towards the psychiatric field. Upon completion of his internship, he was employed as a full-time psychiatric social worker in the clinic at Jackson, Michigan. The psychiatrist director of this clinic is Dr. Warren S. Weil, who is also chairman of this committee on correction of the American Psychiatric Association. Dr. Weil was particularly helpful to Superintendent Arthur Dozier in making plans for the psychiatric clinic, which it is hoped will be constructed for use in the local school. The 1955 session of the legislature appropriated $200,000 for the construction of this clinic. The appropriation was in the second priority building group in the number 1 position. End quote. We will be hearing more about the school's clinic, since I found some articles about it. However, first we should figure out who Dr. Warren S. Weil is, since he was important to Robert Curry's career and also giving Superintendent Dozier advice on how to make the clinic. I'm going to note that it sounds like he was pretty important to how mental health was viewed in this country in general, considering the fact that he was involved in the American Psychiatric Association, which is not without its own sketchiness, which I'm sure at some point we will get into. If we haven't already, it comes up a lot in Colin A. Ross's book, The CIA Doctors, which is a source I've used a lot for the show so far, and I recommend everybody read. But I am starting to ramble and get off course here. Dr. Weil was the author of a book titled Citizens Who Commit Murder, published in 1974. Looking through it is how I learned what I will now tell you about him. He was once the director of the psychiatric clinic and hospital at the State Prison of Southern Michigan. He accepted that post in 1953. In the introduction to his book, he says that he first became seriously interested in the question, why do men commit murder, after the 1952 prison riot at the state prison, which influenced his decision to take the directorship position a year later. Let's read the first paragraph of Chapter 1, Aggression and Homicide. Quote, the present investigation into the causes of homicide was decided upon by the author during an 18-year period while working part-time in the Michigan prison system. As director of the psychiatric services for the Michigan Department of Corrections from 1953 through 1959, and as psychiatric consultant to the Michigan Department of Corrections since that time, the author has to date examined over 2,000 persons who have committed the crime of murder. End quote. So, Robert Curry's former boss, who was also advising on the Dozier School's psychiatric clinic, was an expert on how people become murderers. I hope you understand why all of this deeply intrigues me. It leads me to believe that Curry was likely at least somewhat interested and knowledgeable in the same studies. That, along with advising on the school's clinic, makes me think about the mind control experiments and possibly even program to kill-esque aspects that were occurring at the Dozier School. Let's quickly find out the locations where Dr. Wesley Weil was doing his research, because that could lead us in some MKUltra involved directions. Here is the first page of Chapter 2, The Study in Citizens Who Commit Murder. Quote, this study is based on an analysis of data obtained from 200 convicted homicide offenders, examined while they were serving their prison sentences during an 18-year period ending in September 1971. The cases were selected at random from 2,000 such offenders seen over this period of time. Some of these men had been referred to the psychiatric clinic for treatment. Some came to the psychiatric clinic at their own request or at the request of the parole board for pre-parole evaluations. Others had never been referred to the psychiatrist because of any recognized problem during the period of their incarceration. However, because of the high incidence of serious after effects in the perpetrators of acts of murder, most of these persons are referred to the psychiatrist at one time or another during their long prison stay. The majority of the inmates were examined at the State Prison of Southern Michigan at Jackson in south-central Michigan. Some were examined at the Marquette Branch Prison in the Upper Peninsula. No attempt was made to collect data concerning the race of the offender, as the State Prison of Southern Michigan, from which most of my sample was obtained, contains a disproportionate number of black offenders from the metropolitan Detroit area. Marquette Branch Prison, on the other hand, contains a disproportionately high number of white offenders, since it contains more inmates from the almost all-white northern part of the state. Data was not tabulated as to the sex of the offender, since this sample consisted entirely of male offenders who have been sentenced to serve time either in the State Prison of Southern Michigan, the Marquette Branch Prison, the Ionia Reformatory at Ionia, the Michigan Training Unit, or at the Camp System for Men. All women felons in Michigan are housed at the Detroit House of Corrections in Wayne County and come under a separate arrangement for psychiatric services provided by consultants in Wayne County. End quote. Ionia caught my eye when I first read that, and here is the reason why. From Dr. Colin A. Ross's book, The CIA Doctors. Quote, Ionia State Hospital was the site of MKULTRA Subproject 39, in which investigators cleared at top secret received $30,000 in 1955 for drug testing on prisoners and sexual psychopaths, including interrogation with hypnosis, LSD, and marijuana. MKUltra Subproject 39 documents include a description of 4 psychiatrists, a psychologist, and a physician who participated in the subproject. The director of the hospital was also witting. The documents included 6 signed secrecy agreement forms with names whited out. One of the psychiatrists is described as follows, quote, within quote, as a Navy psychiatrist, he has had extensive experience in whited out in the field of Eastern cultures, Oriental psychiatry, brainwashing, etc. He has also done drug interrogation with criminals and has engaged in narco-analysis and hypnoanalysis, end quote within quote, and end quote. Yes, in 1955, definitely during the period when Dr. Weil was doing his research on murderers there, Ionia was also being used as a place to test drugs on prisoners and sexual psychopaths, which could very well include murderers. It did, in fact, which we know because a John Doe from an eventual lawsuit regarding the testing was there in 1955 for an alleged murder. Oh, and one more thing I found interesting was the fact that one of the people Dr. Weil thanked in his book's intro was Dr. Winfred Overholzer, a mind control psychiatrist we have briefly met in past episodes. His diary from the First World War helped us confirm that mind control experiments were even being done back then. Overholzer was a 32nd degree Mason, and at one point chairman of the Scottish Rite Research Committee on Schizophrenia. He funded LSD research through that committee. I will excerpt from the CIA doctor's book again briefly. Quote, besides strictly medical experiments, Dachau was also the site of mind control experiments involving the drug mescaline. Nazi doctors, including Dr. Kurt Plotner, administered mescaline to unwitting subjects by spiking prisoners' drinks. During the same period, similar experiments involving mescaline, marijuana, barbiturates, and scopolamine were conducted by Dr. Winfred Overholzer at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. The U.S. mind control experiments at St. Elizabeth's were conducted under the auspices of the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, the precursor of the CIA. End quote. There is plenty more about Overholser that we could cover today, but we must return to Dr. Curry at the Dozier School for Boys. Overholser was a prolific mind control doctor, though, taking part in it through 2 world wars and decades after. Dr. Weil, who Curry worked under, made sure to mention Overholser positively in his book's introduction. Back to Dr. Curry now, although I am not sure the doctor part can be included accurately. Despite his studies in college, Elizabeth A. Murray's book, The Dozier School for Boys, Forensics, Survivors, and a Painful Past, notes that Curry was neither a medical doctor nor licensed as a psychologist. The book provides us with more information on what Curry was accused of by former Dozier students. Quote, Boys warned Kaiser that Curry was strange. From the first meeting, Curry regularly questioned Kaiser about how often he or other boys masturbated. He once demanded that Kaiser pull down his pants to demonstrate exactly how he played with himself, claiming that masturbation was the source of Kaiser's problems. The boy took down his pants, feeling ashamed, alone, and afraid for his life. Curry shouted at Kaiser, calling him a freak and a pervert, and ordering him to pull up his pants and get out of the office. The mind games and unpredictability were part of Curry's particular brand of torture. End quote. Also, in his deposition, Troy Tidwell mentions that Curry would come into the cottages at night while the boys were showering. The 2010 Florida Department of Law Enforcement report confirmed that Curry was fired for inappropriate conduct. From the report, quote, Several former students complained of inappropriate physical contact/behavior by staff social worker Robert L. Curry. The majority of those students complained that Curry made sexual advances toward them or touched them inappropriately. However, a few stated that they were sexually battered by Curry. Lennox Williams stated that he was only aware of reports of inappropriate conduct rather than sexual battery against Curry, and that Curry was fired as a result. Curry passed away in August 2000. End quote. That explains the line of questioning we heard earlier in Troy Tidwell's deposition. Curry appears in settings beyond the school in Violet's story, though. Also, apparently Dr. Souza was teaching him how to use the mind control equipment. Because the methods were music or sound therapy, knowing that made me take note of Curry's minor in music that he received in his college degree. It may not mean much ultimately, but I found it an interesting additional piece of information. Souza's interest in music also went beyond his medical methods. This is from a September 15, 1962 Yellow Jacket article titled, Dr. Souza Gives Piano Recital. Quote, Dr. L. E. Souza, psychiatrist for the Florida School for Boys at Mariana, gave a piano recital at Chipola Junior College Thursday, September 6th. The recital was at the invitation of Professor Earl Taylor of CJC. Dr. Souza, an accomplished musician, gave a lecture along with the concert, and the subject of both was the evolution of the races in the American continent since the New World was discovered. About 50 guests attended, who were either senior citizens or members of the humanities class. The recital covered 10 numbers, several of them Dr. Souza's own compositions, and other authors of early American folk music. The lecture and recital covered the time era of the last 4 centuries and was enjoyed by all who attended. End quote. Returning to Robert Curry, let's read a March 17, 1959 article from the Jackson County Floridian newspaper because it elaborates on changes to the school's programs made by him. It is titled, Demonstration Cottage Tried as New Counseling Way at FSB. Quote, by Addie Summers. Mariana. A demonstration cottage at the Florida School for Boys at Mariana forecasts the future in successful treatment of boys in trouble. When a larger professional staff becomes available, Superintendent Arthur G. Dozier has said he hopes to extend to all 19 cottages the same program of intensive counseling of boys and training of cottage fathers, which is proving its soundness at Cleveland Cottage. Quote within quote, in less than a year, the extra time spent on the cottage has paid off richly, end quote within quote, Dozier said. The Guidance Center staff took over operation of Cleveland Cottage last summer. Robert Curry, Guidance Center Director, outlined a program which would allow David Walters, the other psychiatric social worker at the center, to spend half his time at the cottage with cottage father Robert Sealander and on the campus observing boys in class and at work. Boys in Cleveland Cottage have said, quote within quote, the cottage may fall below the campus average 1 month, but it always regains the ground it has lost the next month, end quote within quote. At present, 60% of boys in the cottage rank pioneer or pilot under the campus-wide citizenship evaluation system. Below these ranks are rookie, explorer, and the special rank of grub for boys who have slipped backwards in their progress. All boys must proceed through rookie and explorer before they reach the upper ranks. Several times since the special program has been in effect, Cleveland Cottage has won the honor trophy for earning the most points in the cottage efficiency contest. Into this contest go ratings, which all boys in the cottage have earned at the cottage, on the crew, in class, and at play. The cottage has also won the alternate prize of a free show trip for the cottage having lost the fewest points in the same contest. This summer, the group is planning to celebrate an even bigger accomplishment, a full year without a runaway. Reward will be a trip to the beach. Throughout the time the program has been in effect, small groups of boys have attained particularly outstanding records. 8 recently went on a fishing trip as a reward for going an entire month without receiving a single low grade. The largest number of names on the school honor roll for several months has belonged to Cleveland Cottage. What exactly is the program which has done so much for 36 boys in the Cleveland Cottage? Director Curry explains that it is an outgrowth of the general FSB program. It is the best of everything at the school carried one step further. 5 C's describe the plan. 1. Counseling. 2. Comprehensive care. 3. Complete records. 4. Cottage fathers training. And 5. Concentration on big problems. 1. Every boy sees his counselor regularly, often twice a week. In addition, he meets in joint conference with Walters, Curry, Sealander, and the substitute cottage father, Guy Govart, at regularly scheduled intervals to evaluate his progress and make whatever changes in his program that are indicated. Though all boys on campus receive counseling, the staff is not now large enough to see all this often. 2. Everything a boy does is important in the Cleveland program. Even eating becomes a quote-unquote therapeutic experience, end quote within quote, in which the member of the guidance team directs boys in the use of good manners. The cottage has its own infirmary, where the cottage father treats minor ailments such as scratches, athlete's foot, and colds, instead of sending the boy to the campus hospital. Boys also write their letters at the cottage. A wider variety of indoor games available to boys here takes into account every interest, and several boys have even become good chess players. Each boy has his own locker and is responsible for keeping up with his key. To make it easier for boys to drop off to sleep, a system of piped music is being installed by the electronics crew. 3. Cottage fathers Sealander and Govart keep records which are complete, even down to when each boy gets a haircut. Records on all boys are available in the director's office, but the Cleveland program, again, carries the practice a step further. Misbehavior reports, the causes behind them, and their prevention get thorough goings over by the cottage father and guidance staff. 4. Through his work with the professional staff, the cottage father learns what to look for in boys' behavior and how to help them resolve their difficulties. He learns what records to keep and how to use them. His work has direction. 5. Instructors recognize the old adage that boys will be boys, with the result that a relaxed atmosphere prevails at the cottage. Quote within quote, we get to know the boy through observation, supervision, and counseling, end quote within quote, Curry explained. Quote within quote, this gives us an understanding of his problems and feelings. We have been unusually successful in misbehavior, because we know when a boy has a problem and are on the spot to help him control his own behavior. Frequently, we have been able to prevent repetition of even minor misbehavior, end quote within quote. Long-range goal at the school is the same kind of concentrated attention for all cottages. Superintendent Dozier has said that he looks upon the program as an in-service training project, which, as it spreads from cottage to cottage, will provide the basis for the elevation of training standards that will be reflected tremendously in the boys touched by it. End quote. Many survivors have stated, despite the actual nightmarish things occurring at the school, they were forced to write glowing letters to their families, giving positive descriptions of their treatment and life at Dozier. That will come up again in this episode. It seems that the content of their writing was studied by the staff. The boys had no privacy. In its own way, this is all a form of mind control. And mind control came to my mind during the reading of that article when eating as a therapeutic experience was mentioned. And that kind of takes on a different meaning when you think about Sousa's soup that they were feeding the boys every day, full of drugs. Even more, the music piped in to help them sleep thing just reminds me of mind control, reminds me of the sound wave therapy they were doing and psychic driving. It's creepy. It's very, very creepy. There is another doctor at the school around this time period that I have developed quite an interest in, due to his possible MKUltra connections. His name is Dr. N. Harry Camp. Let's read an article about his arrival at the school, then explore his history a bit. Quote, new FSB psychiatric head arrives. Clinic opens this week. Dr. N. Harry Camp, a clinical psychologist with experience in treating emotionally disturbed children, has arrived at the Florida School for Boys at Marianna to direct the new psychiatric clinic. The clinic opens on a partial basis this week. Dr. Camp received his Doctor of Education degree from the University of California at Los Angeles, with school psychology as his major subject. He did postgraduate work in clinical psychology at Johns Hopkins University. He has also attended Drake University, the University of Chicago, and Loyola College, and has taken part in a number of workshops at Crownsville State Hospital. A native of Des Moines, Iowa, Dr. Camp has been in Florida a year and a half. He was a part-time instructor in psychology and counseling at the University of Miami and had a private practice as a clinical psychologist in Miami. Among many other professional experiences, Dr. Camp directed psychological services in the Baltimore County Schools, Baltimore, Maryland, from 1953 to 1957. In that position, He developed an in-service training program for school counselors and organized the county's first school psychological clinics, which employed 10 staff members and a consulting psychiatrist, and was engaging in diagnosis and therapy when Dr. Camp came to Florida. During World War II, he served with the Signal Corps and in the Army Specialized Training Program, where he helped train Army specialists in language and psychology. Most of his professional life has been spent helping disturbed children. At the Florida School for Boys at Marianna, Dr. Camp will head a team of 7 psychiatric aides, 1 school psychologist, and 1 psychiatric social worker in a unit housing 38 boys who need special attention. He will also work closely with the consulting psychiatrist and with Dr. Earl Saunders, resident physician. The new clinic, Dr. Camp said, is a pioneering movement in line with the present trend in mental hygiene, which calls for the rehabilitation of delinquent children. Here, we will treat causes rather than symptoms. Work at the clinic, he said, will be preventive. The team will attempt to save lives, and at the same time, the taxpayers' money, by dealing with emotional problems before they become more serious. End quote. So, in the Second World War, Dr. Camp served with the Signal Corps and Army Specialized Training Program. Plenty of military intelligence going on there. He helped train Army specialists in language and psychology, and we have learned through this podcast that both fields are where we would find hypnosis and other forms of mind control. He spent time at UCLA and Johns Hopkins, recipients of CIA funding. The one and only Jolyon West eventually did experiments involving kids at UCLA. An entire chapter in Dr. Colin A. Ross's The CIA Doctors is dedicated to his career. Johns Hopkins University has its own chapter as well. I just want to read the final paragraph quickly, followed by a sentence from a different section of the book. The Dr. McHugh he mentions was the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry there at the time. Quote, I would like to know whether Dr. McHugh himself or other members of his Department of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine are CIA or military mind control contractors. The Department of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University, for instance, may experience blowback resulting from decades of collusion, secrecy, and direct participation in mind control experimentation. End quotes. I am sure we would all like to know the same thing. We can speculate, though. Dr. N. Harry Camp studied at all of these sus institutions, then came to work at Dozier during the MKULTRA era, when we have been establishing that kids were experimented on. I do not feel much need to give him the benefit of the doubt. Let's check out a Jacksonville Journal article from May 17, 1959, by Addie Summers, titled Pierce Hall, A Very Bold Experiment. Quote, the boy held up the picture he had drawn, a big man running with his arms outstretched. It was not an artistic masterpiece, but to the boy, and to the psychologist at his side, it represented something more important. It meant that the boy no longer lived in terror of his father. It meant that the quote-within-quote rebellious one, end quote-within-quote, was beginning to understand why his father had treated him as he had, and that he was ready to accept adult guidance. When the youngster was admitted to Pierce Hall, the new psychiatric unit at the Florida School for Boys at Marianna, the psychologist had found that he could draw a boy or a girl, but not a man. The women he sketched were unloving, stern, menacing. In the famous Rorschach ink blot test, the boy projected horrible monsters. He dreamed of monsters at night, vengeful creatures with power over the adults who had wronged him. On the Florida School for Boys campus, his temper had frequently flared out of control. With the punishment his father had inflicted stamped on his memory, he shrank back when FSB staff members reached out to help. The consulting psychiatrist to whom he was referred had recommended that the boy be assigned among the first group to enter the program at Pierce Hall. Into this simple drawing of a man had gone several weeks' treatment. With the accomplishment had come a whole budding new set of attitudes, and even new dreams. Since he didn't hate people now, the boy no longer needed imaginary monsters which could terrorize them. In place of the monsters came dreams of the time when he would himself be a father, and would treat his children with kindness and understanding. Gone, too, were the temper tantrums. Hesitantly at first, then more surely, he dared respond to the love proffered by the Pierce Hall staff. Pierce Hall, as Dr. N. Harry Camp, director, described it, is, quote-unquote, a very bold experiment to see if we can lick juvenile delinquency at its roots, end quote-unquote. Its success is being watched by training schools throughout the nation. The roots of delinquency, Dr. Camp believes, are sociological and psychological. When a boy commits a delinquent act, he is exhibiting symptoms of inner conflict which involve both personality development and environment. Dr. Camp and his staff approach the problem on a scientific basis. Through tests and observation, they seek the causes behind the symptoms. They plan and implement 3 types of treatment. 1. Environmental manipulation. 2. Intensive psychotherapy. And less frequently, 3. Drug treatment. No boy has yet reached the final step in the program. That is preparation for discharge, in which a psychiatric social worker will counsel parents at the school before the boy goes home. During the first week, a boy is at Pierce Hall, and before he joins the rest of the boys in open wards, specialists observe him closely. The FSB physician gives him a complete physical examination, and he undergoes intensive testing to reveal his mental development, personality traits, and educational level. Quote-unquote, in society, if a boy thinks he can set his own rules, end quote-unquote, Dr. Camp said, quote-unquote, he stays in trouble, end quote-unquote. So, definite rules govern life in Pierce Hall. These are explained to the boy in the beginning, so that he knows what he can expect from the staff and other boys and what they, in turn, expect of him. He learns to obey. Treatment is kept consistent. The boy comes to understand what is right and what is wrong, and gradually the confusion, doubt, and uncertainty which have resulted from conflicting judgments disappear. In addition to the physical comforts of life, boys are provided adequate, quote-unquote, male ego ideals, end quote-unquote. Staff members are being chosen in part for their suitability as, quote-unquote, father figures, end quote-unquote, or ideal patterns towards which the young men can aspire. Perhaps most important, boys learn that they are loved and accepted as human beings, and that adults who work with them want to help and can be trusted. Since Pierce Hall has its own dining room, academic schools, and recreation areas, boys are under observation by the staff in all their activities. In class from 8:30 until 3 o'clock, each boy works separately. The teacher directs remedial studies which will bring him up to the proper grade level. Plenty of outdoor exercise contributes to physical health. Each boy spends 1 hour a day with the doctor, who tries to help him to understand himself. Not all boys respond equally well to this treatment because of differences in mental ability and seriousness of their problems. A doctor is usually available at any hour of the day or night that a boy wants to talk. 4 times a month, the boy sees the consulting psychiatrist. Group therapy also helps. Once a week, the group assembles to discuss mutual problems with a teacher or a doctor. In these sessions, boys see that they are not so different or so isolated as they may have thought, and it helps them get along together. Superintendent Arthur G. Dozier expects to add a program of preparation for discharge as soon as a psychiatric social worker becomes available for the unit. The 2 psychiatric social workers now employed at the school, Dozier noted, have a full caseload with boys in the general program. The added facility, he said, does not in any sense mean the school is attempting to go into the mental hospital business, but rather, it is considered an additional tool to help the school. He does not expect to accept those who have already developed borderline psychoses. Quote within quote, the whole meaning of Pierce Hall, end quote within quote, Dr. Camp said, quote within quote, is to determine whether it is feasible to treat severely emotionally disturbed, delinquent adolescent boys to the extent that they can be rehabilitated, end quote within quote, and end quote. As an aside, around this time, another doctor at Dozier, psychiatric social worker David R. Walters, had a research study titled Treatment Variables in Adolescent Sociopathy, published by the Department of Health, Education and Welfare of the United States Children's Bureau in Washington, D.C. in their Research Relating to Children bulletin. All of his research material was obtained from the boys at the school. It sounds quite interesting, but I have been unable to find it. Anyhow, the end of the 50s and early 60s seems to be when experimental programs and doctors were at their peak at the Dozier School, which aligns with MKULTRA activity. This is the period when we see Dr. Curry, Dr. Camp, and Dr. Souza mentioned, and all 3 being up to some suspicious activities. It seems that there was that intensive neuropsychiatric unit for a short time, but staff could not keep up, and it was eventually just turned into cells to put kids in. This reminds me of the clip from the Tidwell deposition we heard last episode, learning that Souza had a solitary confinement cell by his office. Let's read a little more about Pierce Hall and Dr. Souza from Elizabeth A. Murray's book. Quote, Larry E. Hogue was assigned to work in Dr. Souza's office, which was in a building called Pierce Hall. He describes his duty at the beginning of each day as preparing the soup and transferring it from the refrigerator to a large metal tub for that day's treatments. Hogue doesn't know exactly what was in the mixture, except for what he believed was ground meat of some kind. But he does remember the sight of its repulsive orange-red color as he handed the soup to boys in paper cups. According to Hogue, soup making wasn't the only thing going on at Pierce Hall. Boys were also held in solitary confinement there for 30 days at a time in small rooms without toilets or sinks. Hogue recalls that some of these boys came to Pierce Hall after punishment at the White House. Donald Fred Smith, for example, believes he spent a full 90 days in solitary, following a severe beating at the White House. He says that during that time, things were hazy because he was drugged. He remembers clearly having to drink Dr. Souza's so-called bone soup every afternoon before the evening meal. Smith believes Souza also hypnotized him and gave him shock treatments. Smith and other survivors of Dozier view themselves as guinea pigs for Souza's medical experimentation. Some Dozier survivors have searched for state records to document a valid Florida medical license for Souza during the years he was at the school. None has been found. End quote. We certainly can confirm Dr. Souza's lack of license, seeing as we have covered how he eventually fled the country for that reason. However, that was after years of getting away with his experiments in Florida, then up in New Jersey, where his saliva tests for drugs were being recommended to schools by the government. Pierce Hall had its share of interesting employees, often with military service in their past, and not necessarily any experience working with quote-unquote disturbed children, as they were referred to back then. Just one example is Arthur B. Green, who became a psychiatric aide in June 1959. He had previously worked at Graham Air Force Base and was in the Air Force before that. Unfortunately, I have had less luck gathering information about employees that were not the main psychiatrists and psychologists, so we will not be able to explore their role very much. The school received two unique visitors in the spring of 1959, a Dr. William LaRue and his wife, who were from South Africa. They were in the country on a Carnegie grant to study boys' training schools. Upon their return, Dr. LaRue became a technical advisor to the Department of Colored Juvenile Offenders in Cape Town. In a letter he and his wife sent to the Dozier School, LaRue wrote, quote, "The experience and knowledge gained on my recent tour now stands me in good stead. My visit to the Florida School for Boys has been one of the many highlights of my tour, and my wife and I still have happy memories of our visit there. Give our regards to Mr. Arthur Dozier, of whom I formed a high opinion as an administrator and a person dedicated to his task as a reformer of deviating behavior." End quote. I just thought you listeners may find that sort of interesting, more so than some of the other visitors I have left out of this episode. Dr. LaRue worked at the Department of Colored Affairs in apartheid South Africa. The reach of influence the Dozier School had was truly international, and we don't have time today to get into South Africa in terms of MKULTRA, but let's just say that there's nothing there in terms of history. Only 3 months after that Jacksonville Journal article about Pierce Hall, on August 15, 1959, Dr. Camp resigned. Dr. Earl N. Saunders, the resident physician, took over the directorship temporarily until Dr. Paul Mandeville, Ph.D., arrived in November 1959. Let's read a bit of the Yellow Jacket article about him, published on November 28th. Quote, "The new director comes to the school from Knoxville, Iowa, where he has been with the Veterans Administration Hospital for 5 years. Since receiving his doctor's degree from the University of Nebraska, he has also been employed as clinical psychologist at Hastings State Hospital in Nebraska and at a private outpatient clinic in Bluefield, West Virginia. Dr. Mandeville did his undergraduate work in psychology at the University of Rochester in New York State. He also spent 3.5 years in the Army. After living in many parts of the United States, he said one thing that attracted him to the boys' school was the prospect of living in the sunny South. Another was the challenge presented by Pierce Hall and the opportunity to put advanced treatment principles into effect here." End quote. So, another sketchy doctor takes charge, in my opinion. Work at a VA hospital, a state hospital, time in the Army, all great places for mind control research. Also, the University of Rochester took part in unethical radiation research and received CIA funding for the lesser-known Project Chatter, although I cannot confirm that Mandeville's time there overlapped with the project's activity or the radiation experiments. Quickly, from the CIA doctors again, quote, "Chatter was a Navy project begun in 1947 to test drugs that would make a subject talk during interrogation. The Air Force, Army, CIA, and FBI were also involved. One Chatter contractor was Professor George Wendt of the University of Rochester. At one point, according to an undated memo from the Secretary of Defense, the funding for Chatter was $100,000 a year. However, in 1950, the Navy awarded Wendt a single grant of $300,000. The actual total amount of funding Dr. Wendt received is unknown. End quote. Moving on to October 1st of that same year, 1959, when the Guidance Center gained a psychiatric social worker by the name of Arthur Woodruff. His school and past employment are of interest to us, of course. He got his Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology and his Master of Social Work from Michigan State University, and was a classmate of David Walters, also on the Dozier School's Guidance Center staff. Woodruff was formerly employed in the state prison of Southern Michigan, located at Jackson, while attending Jackson Junior College. He spent 30 months in the Army. That is the state prison where Robert Curry and Wesley Weil worked. Small world, I guess. In early 1960, James R. Brokaw joined the Pierce Hall staff as another psychologist. He received his master's degree in psychology from the University of South Dakota and took a year's advanced training at the University of Iowa. He became acquainted with his future co-worker Dr. Mandeville while a trainee at the Veterans Hospital in Knoxville, Iowa. Brokaw's undergraduate work was done at the University of North Dakota, and he spent 2 years in the Air Force. I think at this point you will understand why all of that could be considered a bit suspicious when viewed through a lens of the mind control experiments happening at Dozier. The June 25th, 1960 issue of the Yellow Jacket contains quite a bit of relevant news. The Guidance Center gained 2 new employees, George C. Uzdavinas and Lennox Williams, a psychiatric social worker and psychologist, respectively. Williams eventually became the school's superintendent, and earlier we heard him say regarding the cemetery that more crosses are better than less, considering the amount of bodies buried there. Despite those additions to the staff, the issue also reported that the boys in Pierce Hall had to move back into the regular program, because a shortage of personnel forced the closing of that neuropsychiatric unit. It was the 4th and final step of programming in terms of intensity, and Arthur Dozier stated that it was going to be reviewed. The 3rd step was the student being placed in a cottage directly supervised by the Guidance Center. At the time there was only one, Cleveland Cottage, but the very next Yellow Jacket issue, on July 9th, reported that Madison Cottage was also being turned into one. It seems like the Guidance Center was taking on more work because of Pierce Hall's closure. In anticipation of its reopening, a Dr. Wexler was hired. According to Arthur Dozier, Wexler had worked with some leading psychiatrists. He had experience in psychotherapy, group therapy, and other techniques. His prior employment as a psychiatrist included Hillside Hospital in Belrose, New York, and Lakeland Hospital in Lakeland, Kentucky. He was also trained in surgery and internal medicine. The Opperman Report has an episode about the school and the White House boys, and 2 of them were interviewed, and I am going to play a clip of that because it talks about Wexler. I'm jumping in here quick while editing these episodes because I just want to say that this is my 4th time recording the entire 5 or so hours of material on this topic, and it has been a journey. I have a perfectionist attitude, and despite that, I'm still not really quite happy with the audio quality, but I'm working with
a bunch of limitations when it comes to that compared to normal due to personal stuff, a lot of big changes in life and a move, and I really don't have any of the equipment that I usually do. Though it has been tedious, if I hadn't recorded this so many times, I would have forgotten the mention of Wexler and Dr. Souza on the Opperman report. And I'm going to include the Souza part 2 because it confirms a lot of stuff for us. It confirms the Nazi part. It confirms the Thorazine thing that Robert Straley, another survivor, had mentioned in a clip in the first part of this episode. It talks about Pierce Hall, and then it talks about Wexler. So we will listen to all of that. And speaking about it now just reminded me that Violet, the Project Monarch survivor, that this is all background information for their story, has told me that Dr. Souza even showed them his Nazi uniform at one point. So, yeah, I'm glad that I'm on hour, who knows, of recording this episode. So let's listen to that clip, and I will meet you on the other side.
Well, they had another place up there they called Pierce Hall, which was where they held the real young boys, you know, the 6 and 7 year, 7, 8 year old boys. So when they put me in there, they had some holding cells. So I've been in one of the holding cells, and they started feeding me Thorazine, which is an antipsychotic drug.
Sure.
And because I was a danger of running away again, I was a risk. So they fed me that, and they kept me in there, and they fed me this stuff for 2 months. So because I didn't want me to run away again, and then they had this crazy psychiatrist there. His name was Sousa, and he was making this concoction with like a red bone marrow, and all of this is all posted. You'll be able to read all this on the site because it was in the newspaper and everything. But this guy was actually making some kind of stuff out of red bone marrow, and then you would have to drink this every day, and then he would put these electrodes, and he had an EEG machine, and he would put that thing on there and see if it was changing my brain patterns. And this guy was like from Austria or somewhere, wasn't he, Jerry?
Yes, he was, and from what I can understand by some of the research done on this man, he at one time was under the Nazi rule and had worked with the Nazis.
He was a crazy man.
And he was. He was really a weird individual.
A little bit more about the conditions there. Like what? How about clothes and shoes? Did you have decent clothing and shoes?
Well, I mean, I don't think I ever got a new pair of shoes. If a boy went home, because they had such a turnover, okay? I mean, you know, you might have 250 go home in a year and 250 more come in to take their place. That's what kind of a turnover that you have in there. And, you know, or more, it could have been, you know. So they didn't throw away the shoes when a boy left. You know, they would just throw them in a bin, and, you know, the different sizes. When you come in, you could get a used pair of shoes.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. Let me add a little bit of that, too, Bill.
Go ahead.
Let me add a little bit to that, Ed. Dr. Wexler, who was a doctor when I arrived there, and he's the same individual that would shoot me up with Novocaine during football practice because I had a broken foot, and I played on that foot during practice and the games, and he would shoot me up with Novocaine and everything else to try to keep me on the field. Just before I arrived there, Bill, they had a controversy about Wexler, and this doctor had, this is what kind of people they hired. He worked at Sing Sing for years, and he had a pair of glasses on him that he could not see. I would say the man could be almost legally blind, and the glasses were as thick as the bottom of a Coke bottle. And he even would have some of the boys that worked there, as aides for the infirmary. He would have them to do stitching at times because he could not see well enough to stitch. And he would actually draw a circle with a pen around the wound so he could see it, so he could sew it up. But what I was getting at as far as the clothing, when Wexler first arrived, I believe it was 1959, he wrote a letter straight to Dozier. And that was the super at the time. He said, Mr. Dozier, I have great concerns here because I have so many children that have no shoes. And the athletic foot disease is running rampant, very rampant at this time. And Dozier wrote a letter back to him, which I have in my possession, stating this. Well, I'm not worried too much about shoes. Before you got here, they didn't have much shoes, so why should we worry about it now? But Dr. Wexler was the one, Bill, that ended up getting us those brogans that we were issued when I arrived.
Right. Well, and then again, his daughter would come in and help him too. The doctor's daughter. And she even made a statement, talking about the boys after they come from the White House. They were being cut and everything. And she said, well, I didn't see too many of them that needed stitches. And if they did, they only needed one or two.
What do you think of that, Ed?
And that's
what do you
not
think of that?
To somebody who just paddled somebody.
Interesting stuff. On October 3rd, 1960, Pierce Hall reopened, but as a special cottage managed by the Guidance Center. Apparently, adequate staff could not be found to continue it as it was. There were also plans to put Jefferson Cottage and Polk Cottage under the Guidance Center. As director, the creepy Robert Curry now had much more control over many students. I think Curry was let go in mid-1962, since the September 1st issue of the Yellow Jacket reported that Cameron M. Hess had been the new Guidance Center director for about 2 weeks at that time. On June 8, 1964, the Guidance Center was joined by Robert S. Bridges as a psychiatric social worker. I bring up Bridges because before his employment, he had studied and gotten degrees from the University of Oklahoma, where Jolyon West was professor and head of the Department of Psychiatry. I assume that Bridges may have at least had West as a professor. The December 19th, 1964 Yellow Jacket issue reported that another psychiatric social worker was hired to the Guidance Center. His name was John Franklin Baker, and his career prior to Dozier was pretty interesting. For 8.5 years, he worked for Vitro Services at the Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. Vitro was one of the biggest defense contractors in the country, and at Eglin, they were responsible for operating test ranges and supporting weapons tests. The major one was at Site C-52A, and the weapon tested there was Agent Orange. Beginning in the 1960s, very likely while Baker was associated with Vitro Services at Eglin. According to the Yellow Jacket article, he was doing counseling and administrative duties there. Baker's past employment also included Kaiser Engineers and Midwest Manufacturing Company, two other companies that both had histories building things for the military, at least during World War II. What was John Baker up to during the war? He was serving in the U.S. Air Force, working with base intelligence as a navigator. Another intelligence connection. Lovely. Lovely, lovely, lovely. I am skipping over some of his past, the less sus-sounding parts, to save us time. However, I will note that he was also active in the Boy Scout District Committee. I bring up the Boy Scouts when there are connections because it is an organization with its fair share of controversies involving mistreatment of children. Another interesting dentist started at Dozier on August 1st, 1965, Dr. Sarunas P. Torres. I say interesting because of this little bit from the Yellow Jacket article about him. Quote, his early schooling was in his native land of Lithuania, which he left in 1943 due to communist occupancy. His family and he lived in Germany during the Second World War and came to the United States in 1949. End quote. So, in the middle of World War II, his family fled communist Lithuania and willingly relocated to Nazi Germany. Okay. Martin L. Berg, who joined the school as a psychologist on January 17, 1967, served 2 years in the Army at Fort Rucker in Alabama. The article about his hiring caught my eye because it states that he was attached to something called HUM-RRO, or in other words, the Human Research Division of the fort. Let's learn a little bit about HUM-RRO for the hell of it. We will read a bit from a May 1967 journal article about it written by Saul Levitsky. Quote, HUM-RRO was established in 1951 at the request of the Army and has grown over the years to be one of the nation's largest training R&D organizations. The accompanying chart shows how HUM-RRO is organized, and it identifies and locates its 7 research laboratories, called divisions. It is readily apparent from the chart that a close integration of HUM-RRO with the Army training establishment occurs at all levels, a key factor in keeping HUM-RRO research attuned to Army training problems and in ensuring the usability of HUM-RRO research results. HUM-RRO's assignment is to discover, develop, and apply human factors and social science principles and techniques to improve Army training and operational performance. The organization seeks to develop methods for teaching military skills and knowledges, procedures for ensuring their retention, and ways to permit their maximum use in the performance of military duties. Like other elements of the Army's Human Factors program, HUM-RRO focuses its attention on the individual soldier and on groups of soldiers in teams and units, on the man in the Army's many man-machine and man-weapons systems. The HUM-RO research staff is comprised primarily of experimental psychologists, but includes representatives of other social science disciplines as well as engineers, technicians, and retired military officers. Of the 280 people on the staff, approximately half are researchers or upper-level technical people directly concerned with research. The rest are support personnel. Of the researchers, approximately half, or about 75, are at PhD level. HUM-RO work is managed from the Director's Office in Alexandria, Virginia. Army approval and supervision of the program is a responsibility of the Army's Chief of Research and Development. End quote. At the time of this article, HUM-RO was part of George Washington University. In 1969, it became a private organization, but continued its research under contracts with the Army. Let's skip ahead and excerpt a tiny bit more. Quote, in many other instances, HUM-RO has played the role of a catalyst by providing scientific evidence which helped the Army to select a particular course of action. And all the while it has been pursuing its mission-oriented research program, HUMRO has been contributing steadily to the technology of training, which is taking its place among the other psychotechnologies relevant to the management of human behavior. End quote. At the bottom of the third and final page containing this article, under the title, The Dangers in Government-Supported Overseas Research, there is a very interesting quotation from Senate Subcommittee testimony by John N. Plank, Director of Political Development Studies at the Brookings Institution. Despite being about overseas research, I find it very relevant to what we just read and everything we are covering. So we will check out what he said. Quote, "In any event, it seems to me that classification is carried much too far in government, and that most of the external research in the social sciences presently contracted for by individual government agencies, the Department of Defense, State Department, the Agency for International Development, the Central Intelligence Agency, the United States Information Agency, could more efficiently, more effectively, and less hazardously be supported by a single national foundation for the social sciences. This is emphatically true of such massive basic research as the unfortunate Project Camelot, conducted in Chile. It is true also, in my view, of most studies of groups, institutions, and trends. This leads to the second point. I think it needs to be asked what use is presently made inside government of the products of external social science research. The question is not put tendentiously. I think it is a question to which this subcommittee could legitimately give some attention. Who reads the results of this research? Who makes policy on the basis of an understanding of it? There are, as we know, mountains of it in the State Department, the Defense Department, the Central Intelligence Agency, and elsewhere. My own observation is that comparatively little use is made of it, partly because most of it does not lend itself to direct and immediate policy proposals, partly because persons in policy-making positions in government simply do not have the time, the energy, or necessarily the background to assimilate it and draw operationally useful conclusions from it. If the present system is allowed to continue, we, not only those under government contract, but those of us who are privately financed as well, will soon find closed doors around the world. A few weeks ago in Chile, I was told that some Chileans advocated stopping all social science research of whatever kind, whether mounted under domestic or foreign auspices. Why? Because any research product could be used by our United States Defense Department and Central Intelligence Agency against Chile's national interest. That is a bizarre and extreme position, but by the very nature of its exaggerated quality, it tells us something of the temper in Chile today." End quote. I decided to include that because it makes great points. One being that any of those shady agencies can use information from research in any way that they see fit. So while I cannot prove, for example, that Dozier psychologist Martin Berg directly worked on something sus, he was still contributing to an evil system. Fort Rucker was Division Number 6, the Aviation Division of the Human Resources Research Organization, HUMRO. Okay, that's what it means. So, Berg took part in behavioral science research to improve military aviation performance. At the time, literal millions of tons of bombs, plus Agent Orange and napalm, were being dropped on Vietnam. I wish I could tell you that the eventual departure of the sus doctors we now know and the decades of investigations led to improved conditions at Dozier. We heard what Florida's then governor, Claude Kirk, said after his visit in 1968. The whole, if it was your kids, you'd be up there with guns thing. There was a Tampa Bay Times expose that March that explains the horrid situation at the school and details several suicidal students. However, years later, Claude Kirk said that he was unaware of physical or sexual abuse occurring, because if he had known, he would have done something about it. Nothing was done, and it allowed for over 40 additional years of abuse and neglect to go on. A 2009 article in the St. Petersburg Times sums it up well. Quote, "Reform in Mariana? It was ordered in 1909 when investigators found faked records and the superintendent quit. And again in 1911 when the superintendent was hitting kids with a leather strap. And again in 1913 when children were hired out to pick cotton and the superintendent resigned and laws were changed. And again in 1914, 1920, 1921, 1953, 1963, 1968, 1976, 1982, and 2007, 2 months after Justin Caldwell was beaten, when the DJJ had said, quote within quote, "There are systemic operational problems at our Dozier facility that span the chain of command." End quote within quote and end quote. In September 1967, the Guidance Center was renamed Social Services, and its offices were relocated back to Pierce Hall. George A. Brown is first listed as its director in the December 23, 1967 issue of the Yellow Jacket. I have not been able to find out much about him, but in the process of looking, I did find a June 1st, 1969 article in the Tallahassee Democrat newspaper. 3, technically. The titles are, "Do We Hate Delinquents?" "Nobody Wants These Children," and "The Strap Controversy Center." We will read a little bit of that last one. Quote, by George Kennedy. "The Florida School for Boys at Mariana is the oldest, biggest, and most controversial of the state's youth correction facilities. Both the age and size are obvious and unfortunate. The controversy, however, is not so clear and may prove quite fortunate for the school and its boys. 2 figures symbolize the controversy, Lennox Williams and the Strap, a 4-inch wide, half-inch thick piece of leather with a handle stained black from sweat, was used to impress authority on the rebellious bodies of young delinquents. It is gone now. Its absence is revealing of the sweeping reforms being instituted at Mariana and companion schools. Lennox Williams is not gone. His story is revealing too. Williams, a crew-cut, corpulent man, is one of the veterans of Florida's youth correction system. He was superintendent at Mariana until last February, when he was fired by O.J. Keller, director of youth services. He has since been ordered reinstated. The ostensible reason for the firing was Williams' support of corporal punishment of the strap. After whipping was abolished in September 1968, the runaway rate increased, staff members and townspeople got upset, and Williams told a legislative committee he would resume whippings if Keller rescinded the abolition. The deeper reason for dismissal, though, was the conviction of Keller and top assistants that Williams could never make Mariana over from a confinement institution to a center for treatment of delinquency. He was wed, they felt, to philosophy and procedures that had to be changed. Even Williams' supporters on the school staff admit he was not a good administrator. The physical plant nearly fell apart during his tenure. So did staff and student morale. After his temporary departure, Jack Blanton, deputy director of the division, took over as acting superintendent. Blanton talks tough, moves fast, and commands the unanimous respect of those who work with him. Startling changes have been made in his 3 months. Temporary solitary confinement and loss of privileges replaced the strap. Discipline has been restored. The runaway rate is down sharply. Several top staff members have been fired. A number of others quit. Physical changes are striking too. Contracts have been let to pave outdoor basketball courts so eroded they have become unusable. The gymnasium, once a showplace but almost wrecked by the depredations of uncontrolled boys, is being restored. Baseball fields are being built or rebuilt. Blanton hopes intensive athletic programs will involve the boys and, in effect, buy time for the introduction of more significant changes in academic and counseling programs. What Williams' return will mean to those programs remains, of course, to be seen. But it is clear that, whatever he may be, Williams is neither an ogre nor a fool. Talking with a visitor while awaiting the outcome of his appeal from dismissal, he advocated the same kind of program Keller wants. Beating was not the answer, he said. There just used to be no other kind of control. He will do his best to implement the changes, he vowed. End quote. Former Governor Claude Kirk's visit in March 1968 seems to have been a catalyst to the changes made at Dozier. The Yellow Jacket article about it from March 30th of that year simply says, quote, "Summing up, Governor Kirk said the conditions were deplorable." End quote. It also reported, quote, "Superintendent Williams told the Yellow Jacket that he was delighted and happy that the governor visited." End quote. Considering, as reported later in the Tallahassee Democrat, Williams lost his job because of the whole controversy, I wonder how he actually felt about the governor's visit. I want to note that solitary confinement is known to be very detrimental to a person's mental health, I imagine especially for young people. That Tallahassee Democrat article and the December 21st, 1968 Yellow Jacket article about the school's new intensive care unit mention it as a form of punishment still used. A 1970 Miami News article mentions that the old wooden doors on the cells had been replaced with steel ones. However, that Yellow Jacket article makes sure to note, printed in bold, that, quote, "Corporal punishment is not a part of this program." End quote. Group therapy treatment became the main method used over the next few years, and was generally seen as a success by staff and students alike, at least according to various Yellow Jacket articles. Is the school's own newspaper trustworthy? I'm not quite sure. After 1973, the paper was no longer published. Before wrapping up for today, I think it is only fair that we hear about some of the more recent incidents before the school's closure, and very importantly, the difficult work anthropologists did to uncover dozens of boys' bodies on school property. I want to make sure to note that hundreds of survivors have come forward about the abuse they experienced at Dozier. If we have stayed surface level, it is not due to the lack of evidence. If anything, I have been a bit overwhelmed trying to decide what specific survivor stories to include. This episode is important background information for Violet's story, and because Dozier has been covered elsewhere before, I have been trying to portray it from a unique angle with previously unconnected pieces of information. I truly believe that the institution was used for mind control experiments and other abuses over many years.
If you are listening to this in parts, we will end here for today. If you are listening to the entire mega episode, we will continue in just a moment.
myself